All right, section 4.2 is dealing with experiments. We start here in this first part of 4.2.1 with some terminology. We begin with talking about the difference between experimentation and observational studies. So we'll look at what differentiates the two, and then we'll look at some general terminology. And then we'll end with a TED Talk video that talks about an experiment. The idea is you will hopefully look at that video and look at some of the components of the experiment. All right, so observational study is what we were talking about last section in 4.1. And in that case, we sort of tend to look at, does this one variable tend to lead to a higher value in another variable, right? So is there a correlation? We don't attempt to influence or impose any kind of treatment, unlike experimentation in which we do impose a treatment. So for example, we might ask people how many cups of coffee they drink per day, and then we might ask them what their household income is. And so we might look to see that somehow there is a correlation. The more coffee people drink, the higher their income is. But that is not to imply that drinking coffee increases your household income, right? So we're not imposing coffee drinking on people. That's what you would do for an experiment. So in an experiment, we might break the volunteers up into two groups, and one group might be forced to drink 3 cups of coffee a day, and the other group would be eliminated from being able to drink coffee 3 times a day. And then we follow these groups and force them to continue doing this for 10 years and see if the group that drank 3 cups of coffee every day, did they increase their household income compared to those who did not drink any coffee? And that would show a cause and effect, right? Coffee, everything else in the two groups is the same. The coffee is the only thing that's different. So that would imply that coffee is causing the change, the increase, if there is one, in household income. Okay, so our goal here is to understand the cause and effect, right? So experimentation is really necessary in order to show cause and effect. And so this distinction between observational studies, in which you just observe and ask questions perhaps, but don't impose treatment, and experimentation, where you do impose some sort of treatment on groups, this difference is crucial in the study of statistics. All right, so observational studies of the effects of explanatory variable on a response often fail. In other words, show that there is an effect. One affects the other, fails because there's other things. So for example, the coffee in the example we were just talking about, the coffee, one group of people is drinking coffee, the other group is not drinking coffee. But we notice that people who drink more coffee tend to have higher household incomes. That's not to say that coffee is causing that difference in incomes, but it's the income that could be causing you to drink more coffee. So I mean, one thing is not necessarily affecting the other. It's confounding variables, which are other things that might be causing this. The effect that you see, how a raised income could be caused by something entirely different. It's not being caused by the variable that's also increasing, right? So just because there's high correlation, one thing tends to lead to another, it doesn't mean that it's causing it, okay? So we have to have a well-designed experiment, and then this will eliminate the other confounding variables. Confounding variable is just two things that you can't tell which one is causing the increase. What you were thinking might be causing it is not the case. Something else could be causing it. All right, so here's an example of observational studies that we might think of. Could we run that as an experience, as an experiment? So back in 2013, the mayor of New York City, Michael Bloomberg, one of his pet projects was to try to reduce soda size of sodas that were sold at restaurants and vending machine vendors at sport events, and movie theaters and so on. So they tried to limit the size of sodas, thinking that this would reduce obesity rate in the city. All right, so lobbyists and the soda industry said, well, there's no proof that soda is what's causing obesity in teenagers, or population in general. And so what they said is that there's other things. So is this true? And so really, in order to prove a cause and effect, we would have to run an experiment. And so soda companies simply said that heavier people tended to drink more soda. It wasn't the soda that was causing the obesity, but the obesity of people who were obese just happened to be drinking more soda. And they were claiming that confounding variables, right? So poverty, for example, can lead to obesity. That might sound a little strange. If you're poor, how can you be heavy? But people who are poor tend to not have the ability to make good food choices. For example, they can't afford fresh vegetables and fruit, so they tend to eat a lot of their calories from processed food, which tends to lead a little bit more to obesity. So these soda companies were saying, well, it's not the soda that's causing obesity, but it's poverty. It's other confounding variables. All right. So what would we need in order to show that the drinking of soda causes obesity? We would need some kind of experimental study. And so you might say, well, Mike Bloomberg, you may not really know Mike Bloomberg, but he's really wealthy. He's one of the wealthiest men in the country. Why, if he really wanted to get this ban in place, why couldn't he just pay to have an experiment done? Hire an independent research firm and have them run an experiment. So why wouldn't he do that? He, has more money than anybody else. He's a billionaire. He could afford to do this. Why didn't he? Well, the reason is that this would be unethical. So this kind of a study, experimental study, would think about what it would do. So like, let's say we have 1,000 teenagers who volunteer for this study. We break them randomly into two groups of 500 each. And so this group of 500, randomly selected teenagers, would be forced to drink a liter of soda every day. The other 500 would be forbidden from drinking any soda every day. So that would be unethical because you're forcing them to do something that we think is unhealthy, right? Drinking all that sugary soda would be bad for them. So we couldn't really do this. It would be unethical. Same reasoning that for decades tobacco companies claimed that there was no cause and effect between smoking cigarettes and lung cancer, because you could not run an experiment, right? You couldn't force people to smoke and other people not to smoke. That would be unethical. So for decades and decades, tobacco companies were claiming that smoking tobacco did not cause cancer, that there were other things that were going on that were causing the cancer. All right, so some terminology. An experiment is a statistical study in which you're actually doing something to the experimental unit. So those experimental units, so that what you're doing is called the treatment, right? What you're imposing on those people, or the animals or objects. You might give one group of people a new headache medicine to see if it reduces migraines. You might feed one group of dogs a new type of a new type of dog food to see if it helps maintain a good body weight. You might drop acid on metal tools to see how they respond to acid rain, that kind of thing. All right, so the experimental units are what are being subjected to getting these treatments, or you're imposing a treatment on the experimental units. All right. So the treatment is the thing that you're imposing. Maybe one group gets the new experimental headache medicine, the other random group gets the traditional old treatment. So those are treatments. And then again, the experimental units, those are we'll refer to as subjects if they're humans. If they're humans, we call them the subjects. So you might think about a clinical trial for the coronavirus vaccine, right? Those were subjects who were given a vaccine, right? One group was given the vaccine, another group was given sort of a fake vaccine. And we do that, and we'll get into more details on that, but that is in order to control for other confounding variables. All right, so here's an example of a fairly simple experiment growing tomatoes, and we're trying to see if the amount of fertilizer and the amount of water affects the amount of tomatoes being produced by plants. So we're asking, does adding fertilizer affect the tomato plant, and what about the different amounts of water? So a gardener takes 24 plants and plants 24 similar tomato plants in identical pots in his greenhouse. So they all are getting the same atmospheric conditions. To half of the pots, he adds the soil in the pots, he adds fertilizer. The other half get no fertilizer. And then 8 of the plants get half a gallon of water per day. 8 of the plants get 1 gallon of water per day, and 8 plants get 1.5 gallons of water a day. And at the end of 3 months, he will look at how he will weigh. He keeps track of all the tomatoes he takes off the plants, and he weighs them so he knows how many pounds, let's say, of tomatoes each plant produced. And so that will be what he records for each plant. So he's going to look at whether the fertilizer and water, different watering amounts, affect the tomatoes. Okay, maybe too much water is bad for tomatoes. Maybe a gallon would be better than a gallon and a half. We'll see. Okay, so we want you to look at this and think about what are the experimental units or subjects if they happen to be human. What's the explanatory? What's the response variables? And what are the treatments? Okay, so the experimental units are really just the tomato plants. We would not call them subjects here because they're not human. So the experimental units are the tomato plants. They are what's being given the treatments, right? They're being imposed, some treatment is being imposed upon these tomato plants. So they are the experimental units. There are 2 explanatory variables or factors, 2 different factors here. One is whether fertilizer was applied or not, and whether how much water the plant got. The response variable is simply the weight of tomatoes produced by each plant. It's what we will measure. And then the treatments. So there are 6 treatments. So there are, if in a 2-way table, like you might see in a biology class, is helpful here. So one factor is the amount of water received each day by each plant. And then the other factor is whether they got fertilizer or not. And so there were 24 plants, and so we want 4 plants in each of the different treatment groups, right? So 6 treatment groups, 3 of one factor, 2 different levels of another factor, so that's a total of 6 different treatment groups. And again, 24 total, so we would want to use 4 plants for each of those treatments. All right, so this is a video, a TED Talk. Look at, watch it, and we'll talk about a couple things as we go through it.
So I want to talk today about money and happiness, which are 2 things that a lot of us spend a lot of our time thinking about, either trying to earn them or trying to increase them. And a lot of us resonate with this phrase, so we see it in religions and self-help books, that money can't buy happiness. And I want to suggest today that in fact that's wrong, and that I'm at a business school, so that's what we do. So that's wrong. And in fact, if you think that, you're actually just not spending it right. So that instead of spending it the way you usually spend it, maybe if you spent it differently, that might work a little bit better. And before I tell you the ways that you can spend it that will make you happier, let's think about the ways we usually spend it that don't, in fact, make us happier. We had a little natural experiment. So CNN a little while ago wrote this interesting article on what happens to people when they win the lottery. Turns out people think when they win the lottery their lives are going to be amazing. This article is about how their lives get ruined. So what happens when people win the lottery is, number one, they spend all the money and go into debt. And number two, all of their friends and everyone they've ever met find them and bug them for money. And it ruins their social relationships, in fact. So they have more debt and worse friendships than they had before they won the lottery. What was interesting about the article was people started commenting on the article, readers of the thing. And instead of talking about how it had made them realize that money doesn't lead to happiness, everyone instantly started saying, you know what I would do if I won the lottery? And fantasizing about what they do. And here's just two of the ones that we saw that are just really interesting to think about. One person wrote in, when I win, I'm going to buy my own little mountain and have a little house on top. And another person wrote, I would fill a big bathtub with money and get in the tub while smoking a big fat cigar and sipping a glass of champagne. This is even worse now. Then I'd have a picture taken and dozens of glossies made. Anyone begging for money or trying to extort from me would receive a copy of the picture and nothing else. And so many of the comments were exactly of this type, where people got money, and in fact, it made them antisocial. So I told you that it ruins people's lives and that their friends bug them. It also, money often makes us feel very selfish and we do things only for ourselves. And we said, well, maybe the reason that money doesn't make us happy is that we're always spending it on the wrong things, and in particular that we're always spending it on ourselves. And we thought, I wonder what would happen if we made people spend more of their money on other people. So instead of being antisocial with your money, what if you were a little bit more pro-social with your money? And we thought, let's make people do it and see what happens. So let's have some people do what they usually do and spend money on themselves, and let's make some people give money away and measure their happiness and see if in fact they get happier. So the first way that we did this, on one Vancouver morning, we went out on the campus at University of British Columbia, and we approached people and said, do you want to be in an experiment? And they said yes. We asked them how happy they were, and then we gave them an envelope. And one of the envelopes had things in it that said, by 5 p.m. today, spend this money on yourself. So we gave some examples of what you could spend it on. Other people in the morning got a slip of paper that said, by 5 p.m. today, spend this money on somebody else. Also inside the envelope was money, and we manipulated how much money we gave them. So some people got this slip of paper and $5. Some people got this slip of paper and $20. We let them go about.
So you might think about, at this point, how many treatments this is in this experiment, right? So there are, either you're spending the money on yourself or on someone else, and then that's one factor, and then the other factor is how much money they got. So there's two levels of money, either $5 or $20. And so if you think about it, there are four factors, right? Two levels of one factor, two levels of another factor. So, sorry, there are four treatments that are two different levels. Each of those levels has two levels in it. And so that's a total of four different treatment groups.
Throughout their day, they did whatever they wanted to do. We found out that they did, in fact, spend it in the way that we asked them to. We called them up at night and asked them, what'd you spend it on, and how happy do you feel now? What did they spend it on? Well, these are college undergrads, so a lot of what they spent it on for themselves was things like earrings and makeup. One woman said she bought a stuffed animal for her niece. People gave money to homeless people. Huge effect here of Starbucks. So if you give undergraduates $5, it looks like coffee to them, and they run over to Starbucks and spend it as fast as they can. But some people bought a coffee for themselves the way they usually would, but other people said that they bought a coffee for somebody else. So the very same purchase, just targeted toward yourself or targeted toward somebody else. What did we find when we called them back at the end of the day? People who spent money on other people got happier. People who spent money on themselves, nothing happened. It didn't make them less happy, it just didn't do much for them. And the other thing we saw is that the amount of money doesn't matter that much. So people thought that $20 would be way better than $5. In fact, it doesn't matter how much money you spent. What really matters is that you spent it on somebody else rather than on yourself. We see this again and again when we give people money to spend on other people instead of on themselves. Of course,
Okay, so on that experiment that we're talking about, they were imposing a treatment, right? They asked people to spend money, either on themselves or on someone else, and so that's why this is an experiment, because you're forcing people to do a particular thing, right? All right, so your homework from this section is listed here, and it is due next period.